Count Quinn could barely believe what he was hearing. Andrea continued to explain that Otto might have already told them about the church's efforts to prepare what they called the apocalyptic war. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Andrea shared with the Count that this very battle had actually been raging for 1,000 years. Afterwards, she filled him in on the history. By the time she finished, he almost lost his mind. Whether it was his own kingdom or the other 3 major kingdoms, they turned out to be nothing more than a small, insignificant corner of the world. He couldn't believe that humans had already lost twice, and if they failed again, it would mean complete annihilation. And yet, Roland Wimbledon had the audacity to take on the responsibility of leading humanity to challenge this enemy so powerful it seemed impossible to defeat. He couldn't imagine just how much courage would that take. Just thinking about it made him tremble. He couldn't understand why Roland was doing all of this. What exactly could he have gained from this? Was he not afraid of failing? Andrea didn't have an answer either, but she recalled something Tilly had once mentioned. Although Andrea didn't really understand the meaning behind it, but the Count was curious about what the princess had to say. It turned out that Tilly had assumed that Roland wasn't doing it for humanity. It was more like he was doing it for himself. It was as if he was searching for a new and exciting challenge, like the rest of them were just benefiting by chance. The Count sat in silence for a while, at a loss for words. Once he made up his mind, he wanted to know what was expected of him. Did Roland want him to fight? Andrea shook her head. She tells him that Roland only needed the Count to keep the Kingdom of Dawn stable and provide some support to Grey Castle. However, someone else will come to discuss the specifics later. Hearing that Roland still needed something from him gave the Count a sense of relief. If Roland had been all about helping the Quinn family without asking for anything in return, he would have started to suspect some hidden agenda. But even if there was one, he knew he didn't have the option to say no either. Faking illness had only bought him some time, but if the nobles managed to overthrow the ruling family, he likely would also be pushed out of power anyway. Since he never chose a side, the worst-case scenario was that his entire family could be wiped out because of it. Now with Andrea between the two parties, it seems like this was the only chance for survival. And he trusted that Andrea wouldn't lead their family into a trap. With that thought in mind, he made his decision. He bowed deeply and asked Andrea to deliver his message. He was ready to serve Roland. However, if Roland's forces were to sneak into the city, the Count thought it would take at least a few months to prepare. But Andrea had no such plan in mind. Since the Count had already agreed, they could start right away. Turned out, Roland didn't want a quiet political assassination. He wanted to destroy Nepean in front of everyone, to end his ruling so thoroughly that even the most ambitious nobles would have no choice but to accept it. The Count, however, was feeling a bit skeptical. Could something like that really be pulled off without proper planning? Andrea merely smiled, telling him that perhaps he had forgotten how she got in here in the first place. The Count thought for a moment. Not only did his guards fail to stop her from entering, it was the fact that they managed to sneak in here without anyone noticing. The Count quickly recalled what the butler had mentioned, those so-called friends of Andrea. Clearly, she hadn't entered the mansion alone. There was no way she could have slipped past all the guards by herself, especially with them armed with God's punishment stones. But how did she manage to do it? Sensing his doubts, Andrea reassured him, saying it was better for him to meet them in person. But as for now, the Quinn family's task was to cause a scene, to make sure the entire royal capital's attention was drawn to them. That way, Nepean would have no choice but to step out and face the situation head-on. The scene then shifts to Otto. He didn't seem to be in the best shape, but even in his weakened state, he could still hear the conversation of the guards in the hallway. Apparently, a troupe of performers had been mocking Otto at the castle gates. The guards couldn't help but reminisce about how, in the old days, those same people would have quickly found themselves eaten by the fishes in the river for such disrespect to the Count's son. But now, this very person was locked up in a dungeon, and it was the king himself who sent him here in the first place. When the performers spat on Otto's food, the guards didn't even bother to keep it a secret, and they even thought it was quite funny. As Otto painfully dragged himself up, they placed the meal on the table in front of him, casually mentioning they'd come back tomorrow to replace the candles, since the steward had apparently forgotten to bring new ones today. Otto didn't respond. A deep sense of sorrow washed over him. From the guards' conversation, he understood what had happened. Perhaps the circus clowns had run into the guards delivering his food, and in an attempt to curry favor with Nepean, they'd spit into his meal. But Otto hadn't had a decent meal in days. As he hesitated, the porridge inside the bowl began turning black. He rubbed his eyes and carefully lifted the bowl, trying to make sure he wasn't seeing things. The porridge had definitely turned pitch black. However, the mention of the circus clowns triggered a memory. In a past conversation with Hill, he had mentioned his days as a circus performer. It was a chance encounter during those days that led him to Roland. Hill had even shown Otto a trick, which he called the octopus trick. Somehow Hill was able to turn the water black right before Otto's eyes. He had been amazed back then when the water suddenly darkened, but that was only the beginning. Hill had also shown him another trick. He had pulled out a piece of thin silk, which looked completely blank. But when he dipped it in water and dried it over a fire, Hill's name had mysteriously appeared on the fabric. Remembering that, Otto hurriedly reached into the porridge, feeling for something. When his fingers finally grasped a thin piece of silk, he quickly held it over the nearly burned-out candle, and after a few moments, faint words began to appear on the silk. "Don't worry, I'm here." Meanwhile, in the palace, Anpian angrily shoved the woman in his arms aside and shot to his feet, his face twisted with fury. He couldn't believe what he'd just heard. His trusted prime minister had started a rebellion. Again, he demanded confirmation. Was this truly a rebellion? Not just some ploy to curry favor with those idiots outside the royal capital? He was well aware of the ambitions of the nobles from the outer territories. Their first targets would obviously be the three major families. But what surprised him was that the first to act against him was the Quinn family. Although he'd always been on guard, he had assumed that, given the nature of those three families, they would remain quietly within their estates, not daring to challenge him. After all, the capital was still firmly in his grip, and anyone who dared defy him would be courting certain death. Quinn wasn't stupid, so why would he rebel, and what could he possibly be counting on? Since his guards only numbered in the dozens, so what was he really planning? One of his ministers explained that Count Quinn had reached out to some nobles from outside the city, but he hadn't held secret meetings. Instead, he had publicly sent out invitations, calling on all the nobility to come to his estate and to have them pledge their allegiance. Anpian stood there, dumbfounded. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. But regardless of the details, one thing was certain: he needed to bring Quinn before him immediately. As for everyone else, they would be thrown in prison. He ordered that anyone who resisted would be killed without mercy. After everyone left the room, he stood there alone, his mind flashing back to the old holy city. Every time he thought of it, his entire body trembled. It was such a one-sided massacre. Half hallucinating, he began screaming, begging to not be killed. However, other than fear, there was also a burning hatred. He hated both Grey Castle and Roland. He had always dreamed of governing this kingdom well, to become a wise and legendary king remembered in history. Every single day, he fantasized about tearing Roland apart with his bare hands. But we all know that's never gonna happen. So, all he can do is direct his anger at Count Quinn. He would make sure the Count understood what it meant to face the wrath of a king, at least that's what he thought. Either way, Anpian sat back on his throne, waiting for the news. But before long, one of his ministers burst into the palace. He cried out, "Serbakov is dead. The entire patrol has been wiped out." Anpian grabbed the minister by the collar. He questioned if it was a trap or if there were hidden guards in the mansion. The minister nodded, then explained that those people were lunatics. They were armed with anything they could find: boning knives, wooden clubs, even bricks. Yet, in less than a minute, their entire patrol squad was shattered. When Anpian heard that there were only 7 or 8 of them, his rage intensified. He violently threw the minister to the ground, saying the patrol had 200 men. How could they be scattered by a handful of lunatics? Even if they were 200 freaking pigs, they wouldn't have been defeated that quickly. The minister, trembling uncontrollably, stammered while calling them monsters, saying they were definitely not human. The patrol couldn't even withstand a single blow from them. Their strength, their speed, it's not something a human could possess. Anpian's mind immediately jumped to the 2 pure ones from the church he had encountered before. Could it be? Was Count Quinn made an alliance with the church? His anger surged as he called for his knight captain. A knight entered, kneeling on one knee, awaiting orders. Anpian commanded him to gather every mercenary in the capital, arm them with crossbows and fire arrows, and burn Count Quinn's estate to the ground. And he wanted no survivors. The knight captain hesitated, pointing out that the estate was in the inner district, and setting it on fire could lead to uncontrollable destruction. But Anpian cut him off, barking that if he couldn't burn Quinn alive, he shouldn't bother returning at all. His voice rose to a hysterical pitch as his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He knew that not even the church's God punishment army could stand a chance against overwhelming numbers armed with crossbows. Anyone conspiring with the church was as good as dead. Without another word, the knight captain assembled his forces and marched toward Quinn's mansion. But as they made their way down the main road, they encountered a group of performers. When he asked who they were, the leader of the group merely smiled and said they were just a passing circus troupe. The very next second, the clowns pulled out daggers and charged at the soldiers. The following day, the capital square was abuzz with rumors spreading like wildfire through the streets and alleys. People learned that hundreds had starved to death in the slums last winter because the farmlands outside the city had been exploited, and that farmers from outer towns had been ordered by the king and conscripted to fight in the holy city, where most of the army was wiped out. Everyone was talking, asking themselves the same question: who should they support now? Count Quinn had promised that if he took power, no one would go hungry again. But one thing was clear to everyone: the revolution was coming. Either way, the events of last night's battle spread quickly throughout the city, along with the prime minister's speech. Multiple clashes had broken out, but each one ended in the king's defeat. Inside the castle, Anpian, seething with rage, swept everything off his desk, sending papers and objects crashing to the floor. He was furious since he never reduced the outer city's farmlands. Why was everyone blaming him for everything? One of his ministers tried to calm him, reminding Anpian that the immediate priority was stopping Quinn. After all, the nobles who had yet to choose a side were still watching closely. Anpian cursed himself for not locking them all in prison when he had the chance. Taking a deep breath, Anpian asked how many forces they still had at their disposal. A knight reported that they had 1,500 men in total, combining palace guards, knights, personal retainers, and mercenaries. If they mobilized the servants and maids, they could raise that number by another 2,000. The knight added that the outer castle walls were sturdy enough that even untrained fighters could inflict damage on the enemy. Anpian made a decision. Empty the treasure vault, and tell the servants that for every monster they kill, they'll receive 100 gold coins. And if they win, he will grant everyone titles and lands. But even with this bold promise, the situation remained murky. They didn't even know exactly who was backing Quinn. There were rumors, however, that the notorious Merchant Guild had begun making contact with Count Quinn. The thought of the Merchant Guild's involvement enraged Anpian even further. Those rats, he snarled. They crawl into every corner like vermin. As if the situation couldn't get worse, one of the ministers delivered another piece of grim news. The Tokat family had officially aligned themselves with the Quinns. With all the bad news, there was a glimmer of hope. The minister added that the Rossi family had repeatedly refused Quinn's invitations to join his cause. He can't believe that his father had once been so proud of these three major families. Two had already betrayed him, and the only reason the Rossi family hadn't made a move was because Otto was still locked up. Anpian made a decision. He would send a message to Count Rossi. If he wished to prove his loyalty, he had to bring every man under his command to the palace immediately to support the crown. Otherwise, Anpian wouldn't hesitate to execute his son. It didn't take long for the response to arrive. Count Rossi pledged his loyalty, promising to assist the king. It was one of the few pieces of good news Anpian had received in days. Then, a plan began to form in his mind. Since these three great families had always been so closely linked, why not send the Rossis to wear down the others first? Meanwhile, in the city streets, crowds of spectators lined the roads, watching as Quinn, Hill, and their forces marched forward. Hill couldn't help but marvel at the Count's reputation and influence, saying he never imagined Count Quinn could gain this much support so quickly. Count Quinn waved off the praise, explained it's likely because he once reformed the patrol units and spent a lifetime managing the capital's affairs. Walking behind him was a red-haired man, none other than Oro, childhood friend to both Andrea and Otto, representing the Tokat family. He then turned to Hill and asked him why he brought along the rats too. Hill tells him that he and their leader go way back. He had them don some armor to make the procession look more impressive. But Oro was worried that these people may turn against them. Hill chuckled, saying that's a possibility, but that depends on the stakes. Hill smiled and said Dawn was about to enter a new era, and instead keep being rats. Maybe they could get some new identities after this. The massive procession marched into the castle district, while Andrea stood on a high building, looking down at the palace wall below. As a signal flare shot into the sky, she knew it was time. She calmly pulled out her specially crafted sniper rifle. She raised the weapon and looked through the scope, her gaze locking onto a fully armored knight standing by a ballista. Before firing, Andrea activated her ability, channeling it through her body. Even without stabilizing the weapon, the sniper in her hands remained perfectly still. As she pulled the trigger, the first shot rang out. However, she didn't just stop there. She fired shot after shot, and she loaded, aimed, fired, and reloaded again. Each time she exhaled, another bullet found its mark. With every pull of the trigger, a target fell. Even when the knights realized they were under attack and unsheathed their swords, their efforts were in vain. They had no idea where the shots were coming from. Each time they tried to rally or search for the attacker, they were met with a well-placed headshot. Within a minute, bodies littered everywhere on the walls. The surviving knights scrambled for cover, one of them clearly an officer, shouting for everyone to take cover. He knew there was a witch nearby. He believed that if they stayed behind the walls, they could avoid being shot at. He also ordered them to bring out God's punishment arrows and fire blindly in all directions. Knights ducked behind every cover they could find, losing arrows into the air. But they were too far from Andrea to pose any real threat. With most of the enemy in hiding, it became more challenging to hit her targets. Andrea quickly considered her options. She then recalled the artillery teams from the First Army. So she adjusted the angle of her rifle and utilized her ability once again. However, this time the bullet was shot upwards. Seconds later, it descended toward the commanding knight. The first bullet ricocheted off the wall, grazing his helmet. Just as he stood to bark another order, the second shot pierced his neck. Seeing the remaining knights flee in terror, Andrea was also exhausted. Her magical energy had been completely drained by the intense shooting. The walls, now nearly deserted, became easy prey for the Takira witches. They threw grappling hooks over the walls, and within moments, all of them climbed onto the walls, drawing their weapons, and began their brutal slaughter of the fleeing soldiers. The defense crumbled entirely as the witches descended from the walls and charged toward the palace. At that very moment, to everyone's surprise, the Rossi family officially joined Quinn's forces. Anpian, who had been watching everything unfold from his room, was now completely furious. He cursed Count Rossi as a traitor and swore to wipe out their entire family. He called for his ministers, but his head guard delivered troubling news instead. The ministers had already fled and the guard didn't believe they would be returning. Anpian, confused at first. So the guard explained, "They've all abandoned you, your majesty. Only a few of us remain by your side." Anpian erupted in fury, cursing them all as traitors and blaming them for the ruin of his kingdom. The guard captain tried to calm him down, promising that the deserters would face their consequences in due time. But right now, they should retreat. If they didn't escape now, it would be too late. But Anpian refused to leave just yet. He had one last thing to do. He wanted to see the betrayers suffer first. He ordered the guard to bring him Otto's head as a final act of defiance. With no choice, the head guard left for the dungeon. Alone in his room, Anpian sat heavily on his throne. He knew he had lost everything. He stared at his hands for a long time, feeling the weight of his failure and betrayal. But the head guard never returned. Instead, the door creaked open to reveal unfamiliar faces. Their weapons, still dripping with fresh blood. Not only they didn't look tired after battling for so long, but if anything, they seemed energized by the carnage. And then Count Quinn, Otto, and Oro all stepped into the room. Anpian stood there, drenched in cold sweat, struggling to comprehend how things had spiraled so far out of control. Oro, standing across from him, calmly explained that they had men hiding in the palace's secret tunnels for some time, and they also got people inside the circus troupe. This meant they could have killed Anpian in his room at any time. If Roland hadn't needed a dramatic public dispute, Anpian would have been long dead. Oro looked disappointed. He pointed out that what had completely shattered his faith in Anpian wasn't the imprisonment of Otto, though that had been a terrible blow. It was actually that Anpian had gone so far as to use Otto as leverage to threaten Count Rossi, and worse, he had even planned to kill him. Oro sighed deeply. He had once believed that even if they could no longer be friends, they would never forget the bond they had shared in their youth. But Anpian clearly didn't care about any of that. But from what Oro said, he figured that all of this was Roland's doing. It was Roland who was behind all this. Anger surged through Anpian as he glared at the group before him. He shouted that all of them were aiding the demons, claiming they not only betrayed the legacy of their ancestors, but they handed over this kingdom and its people to him on a silver platter. He turns his gaze toward Count Quinn. He tells him that he will never be properly sit on the throne, and he forever be a puppet. He believed that Roland wanted to swallow the entire kingdom of Dawn, and everyone here walked right into his trap. In the end, he tells Count Quinn that his fate will be no different from his. And eventually, he will be dragged into the abyss, just like him. Suddenly, a voice came from outside the room, telling Anpian he was wrong. The voice belonged to Andrea, stepping into the room saying Roland didn't do this for power. He only had two goals, saving Otto and protecting the witches. Anpian instinctively began to argue, but when his eyes met Andrea's, he froze. There was something about her that struck him deeply. As she introduced herself, confirming his suspicions, everything clicked in his mind. At that very moment, everything made sense. After a pause, Anpian wanted to know why. Perhaps what he truly wanted to ask was why she had chosen to align with the three major families instead of him. Like Otto and Oro, Anpian had always held a deep affection for Andrea. Even if his defeat at Roland's hands was inevitable, he couldn't understand why Andrea had also turned her back on him. He had believed he could offer her more power, more influence, more of everything. In his heart, he was convinced that if it weren't for the unfortunate incident so many years ago, he would made her the queen, and this kingdom would have been shared between him and Andrea. Oro glanced at Anpian, not too pleased with what he was saying, but he kept it to himself. Andrea, however, shook her head. That would never happen because she's a witch. She is also one of those so-called fallen Anpian vowed to exterminate. Her words completely shut down anything Anpian planned to say, also shattered any lingering hopes he had. He had spent his life railing against witches, condemning them as enemies to be purged. And now, the woman he had once loved, the one he thought might share his future, was one of them. Count Quinn took a step forward, looking Anpian directly in the eyes. Tells him that his rule will now end, and the kingdom of Dawn will no longer be shaped by his ideas. Witches will be free, and given the same rights and status as anyone else. Andrea, now drained of her magical energy, leaned heavily on someone for support. Anpian, clutching his forehead in disbelief, struggled to accept the reality in front of him. He couldn't believe Quinn would betray the ancient vows sworn by their ancestors by killing a royal family member. He doesn't believe Count Quinn will ever kill him, since such an act would brand Quinn a king murderer, a label that would make the nobles distrust him forever. But Quinn shook his head. He has no intention of doing that. If not for his family being pushed to the brink, he wouldn't have come this far. All he needs from Anpian is a vow. Swear to leave the kingdom and never set foot on its soil again. In return, he can take his people and leave the capital peacefully. Otherwise, he will spend the rest of his life in a dungeon, just like what he did to Otto. Without hesitation, Anpian chose the first option. He swore the oath and, true to his word, departed the castle with those still loyal to him. But as he left, Andrea noticed a brief smirk on Elena's face. Just then, a familiar voice called out from behind. It was Otto. He had been filled in on everything that had transpired and thanked Andrea for saving him. Andrea smiled and asked him why so formal with someone who saved his life and was his childhood friend. Otto looked flustered for a moment, at a loss for words. Oro stepped forward, laughing heartily, slinging his arm around Otto's shoulders. Come on, don't forget who was the leader of our little group back in the day. She's our boss, you remember, right? Otto quickly wriggled free, embarrassed, while Oro kept on laughing and suggested that they should all get together properly, in their old hangout place. Andrea was surprised that the Silver Antler Tavern was still standing. Oro shrugged, saying it's owned by the Rossi family, after all. Sure, the management is awful, but it's not bad enough to go out of business. He then left, deciding to go ahead and get ready for the party while giving Andrea and Otto some privacy. The female knight who had been helping Andrea bowed and winked playfully before departing. However, Otto felt a slight awkwardness, unsure how to begin. He suggested they go for a walk. Watching Andrea stumble slightly, Otto hesitated, wanting to help but feeling too embarrassed to offer his arm. Andrea noticed and reassured him, explaining that it was just the aftereffect of using too much magic. She tells him that all witches have to go through this in their daily training and they will be fine after a night's rest. But Otto had something on his mind. He walked beside her in silence for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then finally asked if she remembered what he said to her back in Neverwinter. About Oro always go and visit her grave every year. Andrea said she does. Otto then continued, saying Oro goes to her grave every year, but he never told her this before. He also did the same. He nervously took a deep breath, explained that he couldn't forget Andrea, and when he saw her writing in the dungeon, especially that message, saying don't worry, I'm here, he couldn't explain the joy he felt inside. That's why, no matter what, he has to say this now. He flushed slightly, then asked if Andrea was willing to stay here. Andrea didn't seem surprised by the question. She smiles gently, however, she tells Otto she appreciates everything, but he's one step behind. She already has someone she wants to be with. Her response hit Otto hard. He stood quietly for a moment, processing the words. Asking if it's His Majesty Roland, trying to hide the disappointment in his voice. He believed Roland was better than he could ever be. Hearing this, Andrea was shocked. She and Roland? She questioned Otto if he thinks she will compete with Nightingale for him. She asked the question with a hint of exasperation. Then, realizing what she'd said, her face turned slightly red. She coughed and added quickly, just forget what she said. But it's nothing like what Otto is imagining. Otto was slightly caught off guard, then she explained the real truth as being a witch means she can't continue a noble family line. And honestly, she doesn't want to be bound by the rules of nobility anymore. 10 years is a long time, and she's no longer the flower of dawn she used to be. She just wants things to stay as they are now. With that, Andrea turned and began walking away. Otto opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but in the end, all he could do was watch her retreating figure disappear into the distance. A few days later, she went to see Count Quinn. When he learned that she planned to leave today, he tried to persuade her to stay a little longer. Otto, Oro, and the others wouldn't want her to go so soon, he said. But Andrea shook her head, a gentle smile on her face. She tells him that there are people waiting for her back in Neverwinter. Besides, with the shift in power, he and everyone shouldn't be spending time at banquets or on leisure. They are all good friends, and one meeting is enough. The Count thought to himself that Andrea had changed a lot. After a moment, he asked her if she had any advice for the upcoming negotiations. Andrea, not well versed in politics, admitted that he might be more suited to offer insights. However, she did offer one piece of advice: don't make the same mistake Anpian did. Quinn explained that after witnessing Roland's power, only a fool would think of opposing him. Andrea continued by telling him it's not just about power. The upcoming divine war is about the survival of all humanity. Internal conflicts will only hasten their downfall. Neither of their nations can survive such a cataclysm alone. The true priority is survival, and at the moment, that hope rests with His Majesty Roland. As long as Dawn maintains order and stands firmly with Grey Castle, they can face the war together. The Count listened carefully and then said he understood. As Andrea turned to leave, Quinn impulsively called out her name. She turned back, telling him there was no need to see her off. She believed that the Count had plenty of matters to tend to, and he didn't need to worry about her safety since the Takira witches would escort her back to Neverwinter. The Count shook his head. That's not what he meant. There was a brief pause, and then, almost in a whisper, he said, I'm sorry, my daughter. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many thoughts he had kept inside. He wanted to explain himself, to tell her everything he had held back over the years. But time had passed, and now those words felt like weak excuses, mere attempts to shift blame or seek redemption. Yet, as he looked at Andrea, he thought he saw her smile. She nodded slightly and said softly, "I'm going now." However, in her voice, the Count felt a sense of understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. As she walked away, tears welled up in his eyes, streaming down his cheeks. He just stood there, listening to the fading sound of her footsteps until they disappeared completely. Meanwhile, a ship sailed away from the port of Dawn, carrying Anpian, who sat by the window, staring at the waters outside. He was thinking about how things would have been different if he were still king. Surrounding him should have been a royal fleet carrying the kingdom's banner, and fresh meals should have been delivered by his servants whenever he wished. He glanced at a map laid on the table before him. His destination was Wolfhard Kingdom, a place where certain nobles had old ties with his father. Anpian was willing to offer generous rewards if they helped him reclaim his throne. As he mulled over his plans, he tugged at a string by the table which connected to a bell. He was expecting a maid to bring in some fruit, but after several moments of silence, there was no response. Irritated, he pulled the string again, but still, nothing happened. Frustration grew as he wondered if he had fallen so far that even the maids dared to ignore him. Rising from his seat, he left his cabin and stepped into the corridor, but it was eerily empty. The silence pressed in, making him a bit anxious. Had they all abandoned him? Anpian still believed that even if his servants and mercenaries had left, the knights, those loyal to the royal family, would never desert him. And if they ever see people leaving, they will definitely stop them. But this is way too quiet. Growing anxious, Anpian climbed to the deck, but the moment he stepped onto it, a blade pressed against his throat. It was a short sword, still having blood dripping down from it. He stared in shock at the person. It was Elena dressed in a maid's uniform. Anpian asked what he was doing, and if he knew who he was, trying to assert his authority. He tells Elena he's the king of Dawn. Before he could finish the sentence, Elena swiftly slashed his throat. Anpian's hands instinctively covered his neck, trying in vain to stop the blood from spilling out. However, his strength drained quickly, and he then collapsed onto the deck. As his vision blurred and darkness began to close in, he heard a voice from above, "In the end, you're just another mortal." And then, everything went black.